But yeah, let's kick off. Okay. So welcome to today's webinar, hosted by Anti-Shelter. My name's Annie, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting, most of us, on Larrakia country here in Darwin, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, which is the Larrakia people, and pay our collective respects to elders past and present, and also extend those respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. It's Homelessness Week, and as part of the events happening this week around the Northern Territory and Australia, we're pleased to be able to bring you a webinar on Everybody's Home's latest report, which is called Out of Reach, which was released in July. The report examines the dramatic increase in the cost of renting across Australia, which is an over 50% average increase across Australian capital cities in the last 10 years, which is huge. And it also explores the decline of social housing stock and presents policy targets to rebuild social housing stock across Australia, which is all particularly relevant to the NT, where urban social housing stock has been declining significantly since 1993, when there was approximately 9,000 social housing dwellings in the Northern Territory urban centres, to 2023, where there are approximately 5,000 urban social housing dwellings. So quite a significant decline. And of course, it's incredibly tough to be a renter in the Northern Territory, not least because we have very few rental protections through the RTA, but also because I believe in the March quarter, Darwin had tied with Canberra the second highest rent prices for houses of any capital city in Australia. So the webinar will run for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and there's a chat function if anyone's got any questions. We're joined today by May Azizi, who is the national spokesperson for the Everybody's Home campaign. May is also the Deputy Director for Anglicare Australia. May, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We look forward to hearing about the report from you, and I'll hand over to you to take it away.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks for organising today's webinar. I think it's something that we've been wanting to do for a long time as a campaign to connect with people working on housing in the Northern Territory, and this is such a fantastic opportunity to do it. As Annie said, my name is May Azizi. I'm the national spokesperson for Everybody's Home, and I've had the privilege of being a spokesperson since 2022. And for those of you who don't know, Everybody's Home is a campaign that's made up of 500 housing, homelessness and welfare organisations across Australia. So that's, for example, people like Homelessness Australia, the Community Housing Industry Association, the Shelter Network, and of course Anglicare, where I work in my day job, people like the Salvation Army and so on. But we've also got 43,000 average Australians who are signed on to the campaign, because they are passionate about housing and housing affordability and really wanting to do something meaningful to tackle this problem. So I'll also start, I should say, by acknowledging that I'm joining you all from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra, and pay my respects to the elders of the lands that I'm joining you all on, as well as paying respects to the First Nations people on all of the lands that we're joining on. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I'll take you through today, where this report comes from, what it's found and what it means for the Northern Territory. So to give a bit of background, there is a reason that we think there is a relationship between social housing, the decline of social housing, and rents. We're starting to understand that connection more and more as the years and decades go on, which is really something that I'm keen to chat about before we get into the results of the report. And then the report itself, which looks at rent increases over the past 10 years and how that correlates with the decline in social housing over the past decade, and most importantly, what we need to do to turn that around. So I'm going to start very, very, very big picture. And I imagine that there are a lot of people who are going to be watching this who know a lot about the housing crisis. And so some of you may wish to, skip over this bit. But this is something I always start with, because we haven't always been in the midst of a housing crisis in Australia. We use the word crisis because it suggests that something acute is happening. This is not a normal state of affairs that we should be getting used to, although we are being conditioned to get used to it. But Australia did once have affordable homes to rent and to buy, and the housing crisis is really something that's emerged in the last 3 to 4 decades. And we actually have more housing than we've ever had before. We've never had more homes per person than we do now. That's a number that steadily increases at every census. The number of homes per person continues to go up. And we get told again and again that supply is a really important part of the solution. When people say supply, they usually just mean generic supply. So if that was working, why, or if that was the solution, why isn't it working yet, when that is actually one part of the picture in Australia that's actually going pretty well? So I'm going to go kind of right back. Back when Australia had affordable homes to buy and to rent, the government was a really big player in providing homes to people. At the high point of construction, about 1 in 4 new builds was being built by the government. That was the late 1950s and early 1960s, which is an enormous amount of building, but also an enormous share of building. And 1 in 3 renters, right up until the early 80s, used to rent from the government, and that was all sorts of people. It was people like teachers, construction workers, public servants, you name it. I'm from Canberra, which is where I'm joining from today, and Canberra used to be 70% public housing, and that was mostly for public servants, so people on average incomes, average working people, and about 75% of people who were in public housing right up until the mid-70s were average working people. So they were just people who had, normal jobs, on middle incomes or low to middle incomes, but they were working people, but by and large. The picture really started to change in the past couple of decades, as the federal government especially really started stepping back from providing housing and funding housing. And so states, in response to that, states and territories have really been changing who is eligible and who is able to get these homes as the system becomes more and more residualised. So increasingly, this system is not so much about directly providing housing, because this was a policy response. Social housing is something the government used to do as its main policy intervention in the housing space, providing homes for people who need them. Nowadays, that's not really the government's main policy response anymore, and this is basically just a residualised system, unfortunately, for people who need it. And so it's now more of a safety net, but as we all know, it's a pretty dysfunctional safety net. And if you need social housing in most parts of the country, you're going to be waiting for a very long time. You're going to find it very difficult to get into the system at all. So I've got a couple of charts. I don't like to spend, I've gotten a lot of feedback on the amount of numbers and charts that I use, so I'm trying to scale them back a little bit. But I did want to show, this is as far back as we've been able to go. It's very difficult to find a reliable information on how much we were spending on housing earlier than this, budget papers and things like that, but this is the earliest we've been able to track it. This is how much money the federal government has spent on social housing in the past couple of decades, and you can see that support for market housing, so that is things like Commonwealth rent assistance, things like the capital gains tax discount for investors, things like negative gearing tax deductions for investors, that is growing constantly at every budget. You can see it's growing exponentially. Support for social housing isn't really growing. You can see we had a little bit of we had a major spike during the global financial crisis. But besides that, government is really reprioritising how it's spending money on housing and focusing much more on supporting private rental and private rental investors, as opposed to just building homes and providing them to people directly. So this is what it looks like adjusted for inflation. So spending is really going down. You can see the federal government really stepping away from providing homes to people directly. And at the same time, you can see that the cost of housing, this is to buy, this is not to rent. I'd love to do one of these for renting, but the cost of housing relative to how much people are earning is also going up at the same time as the government's policy responses are changing. So this is, I think, really important background, and this is really why our campaign is so focused on social housing, because when you look back at what Australia has done in the past, what are the things that have worked, what are the things that are associated with good results, and, you know, house prices and rents that are under control for most people. It is the government playing a big role in providing housing. And when you look around the world right now at the countries that are either starting to turn their housing crises around, or better yet, the countries that have avoided a housing crisis altogether, they are countries where the government is playing a really significant role in providing housing. They are not just leaving it to the private market. So this is a big part of why this is an important focus for the campaign. So that's been kind of big picture the last couple of decades. This report, Out of Reach, looks at the past 10 years, where we've seen another big decline in the share of social housing across the country, from 4.7% in 2013 to, depends on which number you use, 4.1% in 2024. There's also figures from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute that suggest it's actually more like 3.8%. But we know that in the past 10 years, we've seen a major decline in social housing. We also know that that period has been associated with a huge increase in rents across the country. Rents have surged 57% from $473 in 2015 to $742 in 2025. I want to say this is based on capital cities. So I know that is uniquely irrelevant to the Northern Territory. Obviously, we can see that there are broad trends around the country, but what we did here was we looked at capital cities around the country. So when we, well, hang on, I'll stay here for a second, actually. I'll talk a little bit about what the kind of picture shows. So we can see that rents everywhere have been really going up, but to focus a little bit more on what we're seeing nationally before I get into the Northern Territory, what we've seen is that cities that have historically had a reputation for being pretty affordable, so Adelaide, Brisbane and Hobart, have seen the biggest rent increases around the country in the order of about 70% over the past 10 years. And the biggest rent increases have been in the past 3 years. So what we've seen is that Sydney and Melbourne, of course, are continuing to grow, and rents there are pretty out of control. But we're seeing that cities that had previously had a reputation for being quite affordable are now also really starting to catch up. There's a couple of things, going on there. One of them is obviously that the past 3 years where we've seen the biggest spikes have been, been associated with that post-pandemic period. We know more and more people are able to work from home. That means people can leave places like Sydney and Melbourne, move to more affordable parts of the country, and that obviously has implications for the locals who continue to live there and are competing in the rental market on, lower wages than what you'd see in Sydney and Melbourne. So it is a big problem. But I think we're also seeing that rents continue to grow in Sydney and Melbourne, but they can only grow so much and so fast because there's only so much that people can afford to pay. So I think there's a couple of things going on. All right, and now to look at the Northern Territory, which is, as we know, pretty unique. So social housing has increased in the Northern Territory, but we do know that the need in the Northern Territory is much greater. So one of the key kind of philosophies that underpins our campaign is that if you want to make housing more affordable for everybody, you need to make social housing an option for more and more people. It can't just be a a dysfunctional safety net for people at the margins. The issue that you have in the Northern Territory when you look at numbers like these is they can be pretty misleading, because we know that need is also rising in the Northern Territory. So social housing supply is also rising, but that doesn't mean that social housing is becoming an option for more people who are on low and middle incomes. That's not what's happening here. So it's an interesting picture, and it's a picture that's quite different to what we see nationally and what we see in other capital cities. So that's what I would say. We do know rents are still going up as well in the Northern Territory. So this is what Darwin looks like in our report. You can see that there's been modest increases over the past 10 years, modest compared to other capital cities. I mean, it's interesting, that we're in a housing crisis when rents can go up by almost 20%, and people say that that's pretty modest. And I dare say that this is a part of the country where wages are not going up by 20% every 10 years. But certainly by the standards of other capital cities, this is a fairly modest increase. What's not modest is the increase that we've seen over the past year, and especially over the past 3 years. So you can see here there's been a 10% increase in rents for houses, a very high 25% increase for rents in units. And when you put that together, rents have gone up by about 18% in the past 3 years on the whole. And the past year has also seen a massive increase, particularly in rents for units. So this is, you can look at it and think that the picture looks quite modest over the past 10 years, but what we can see is there's been a real boom and bust cycle, and that the past 3 years have been associated with some pretty major rent increases. Again, I want to stress this is Darwin, and there's obviously a lot going on across the Northern Territory that our report doesn't look at, and which would be very interesting, and which I'd be really interested in exploring in a bit more depth. So what we can see is that social housing supply has really stagnated across the country. Stagnated in real numbers, but as a proportion of total housing stock, the picture really is getting worse right across the country. Rental prices have increased dramatically in every capital city over the past decade. The past 3 years, not just in the Northern Territory, this is something that we've seen right across the board. The past 3 years have seen really, really big rent increases in most capital cities. The past 3 years have driven a lot of that growth that we've seen across the country. And we do also know that there's a higher need for social housing in the Northern Territory. As I said before, it's still being used as a safety net, but the higher numbers of social housing in the Northern Territory just reflect a greater need. So if we're serious about increasing, or I should say, reducing housing stress across Australia, we think the key is really boosting social housing, and we provide some estimates in the report for what that would look like. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, who are the government's main advisors on housing, have recommended that we aim for a target of 6% social housing over the medium term. They don't define what that means, but they say 6% over the medium term and then 10% over the long term. So we model in this report out of reach what would that mean? How much building would we actually have to do to get to 10% social housing stock? Now, we've done some work on this in the past as a campaign, because we know that there are 640,000 people across the country who need social housing and are eligible for it, but can't get it. Clearing that backlog would mean building about 30,000 homes every year for the next 2 decades. So that's enormous. To get to 6% over 10 years, we would need to be building 30,000 homes per year. To get to 10% over 20 years, we would need to be building 55,000 social homes per year. So we would really need to be scaling up the amount of social housing building that we would need to do to meet the targets that the government itself, or the government's advisors itself, have actually recommended. That is a pretty enormous number. And we had a bit of a conversation as a campaign about these useful numbers because it can really make the problem seem so big and so insurmountable. To put it into context, the government is aiming to build 30,000 social homes over the next 5 years. That's almost nothing. I mean, that doesn't even replace what's coming offline over the next 5 years. Right now, the government's targets would see us go backwards. In the end, we decided that we did need to put out these figures because every year that we don't, we leave a big investment in social housing is another year where we fall further and further behind. And we can see from these numbers the implications of that are that rents will just continue to get more and more out of control and will be more and more at the mercy of the private rental market, which is simply not delivering housing that is affordable for people. So we're really urging the government, and we're very pleased to have been given the opportunity to do this webinar today, because we're keen for everybody to join this push for the government to really boost social housing and to do something about social housing at scale, because that is really one of the only ways that we can make a lasting impact on this housing crisis. So I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation and some questions.